Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Panelists, Executive Director of the Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and Associate Provost for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. It has been 6 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and today is also Ukraine's Independence Day. In the months since the war began, we've hosted multiple panels on various dimensions of the war in partnership with Northwestern's Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies program. And we're especially grateful that each of these panels has featured leading Ukrainian scholars from the Kyiv School of Economics and elsewhere. Since then, Northwestern and the Kyiv School of Economics have become institutional partners. And we're thrilled that KSC's Rector, Tymofii Brik, will be teaching at Northwestern this year and developing new collaborative research between our institutions as the Buffett Visiting Professor for 2023. On this 6th-month anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we aim to provide deeper insight than the daily news headlines. And so we have reassembled some of the experts from across our campus and from Kyiv who have provided such helpful analyses in past discussions over the last 6 months to see how their views have changed and to get their assessment of what's to come. So joining us today, we have Tymofii Brik, Rector and Head of Sociological Research at the Kyiv School of Economics, Benjamin Frommer, Associate Professor of History at Northwestern's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, Olga Kamenchuk, Associate Professor of Research with the Northwestern Institute for Policy Research, Ian Kelly, Ambassador in Residence at Northwestern University, and former U.S. Ambassador to Georgia, and former U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Tymofii Mylovanov, who is President of KSE, the Kyiv School of Economics, Jordan Gans-Morse, Associate Professor of Political Science and Faculty Director of the Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies program at Northwestern. Michael Rogers, Senior Fellow and Adjunct Professor in the Kellogg Executive Leadership Institute at Northwestern, and Gayle Woloschak, who is Professor of Radiation Oncology and Radiology at Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have each and every one of you with us. Now, for those in our audience, we will reserve some time for questions towards the end of today's panel discussion. In the meantime, please submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And please be sure to note the name of the speaker to whom you'd like the question directed. So, Tymofii Brik, let's begin with you. Tymofii, today is Ukraine's Independence Day, and I imagine that it has special significance this year. How is this day being celebrated where you are in Kyiv? What have you observed?
Welcome everyone to this panel. Thank you for joining us, and thank you very much for inviting us yet again. I want to start with saying thank you to the Northwestern University and Buffett. Specifically, we've been partners for such a long time, and thank you for your support all of these 6 months. To answer to your question, I apologize in advance for some background noises, because actually I'm hosting a small party for my friends. We have gathered together to celebrate the Independence Day, with the cooking traditional dishes and, just supporting each other. This is still important to have these bonds with friends and families. At the same time, I have to admit that, not everyone are so optimistic in Kyiv. Not everyone is celebrating together. Unfortunately, so many people are split apart now. The city is quiet. A lot of people moved to suburbs on some other safer places due to some rumors and anticipation of possible provocations by Russia. That's how people are now planning their, family dinners and evening plans. And something unique is happening. There is a very unique symbolic celebration in the very center of Kyiv. there is a parade of Russian vehicles, armored machines and tanks on the center street of Kyiv, Khreshchatyk. Usually this is a place where, we show support to our military, where soldiers are marching in their parade uniforms. But this time, the administration of President Zelensky, they made this unique manifest, the unique symbolic appreciation of the resistance and resilience of Ukrainian nation. They gathered all the captured Russian vehicles that partially destroyed, partially just abandoned, and they put them as a showcase in the center of Kyiv, just to show that Ukrainians are not afraid of this Russian armor, and that we actually, we surprised the world and we surprised the Russians, and the Russians promised to have their own parade in the center of Kyiv. And that's what they actually got. They got, destroyed, burned, and captured vehicles that we now possess and can show to the world. Other than that, people are trying to show their spirit and to show their support to our military and everyone who is now fighting in the trenches in the south and in East Ukraine.
So, Tymofii, you're a sociologist, and I believe you've been actually conducting some surveys during the course of the last 6 months. How would you describe public perception of the war? And in particular, what is your research beginning to show about differences among different demographic groups or geographical groups, et cetera?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. Of course, a lot of people are wondering about the changes in the Ukrainian society, how people react to the war, what people do, what people think about. And I will refer to several sources. Despite the war, despite this terrible crisis, there are many scholars and polling companies that are still gathering data. So we still have capacity to conduct research. And I'm working closely with colleagues from different organizations. And I will refer to different polling companies. Polling company Gradus, then the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, and Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. They collect different types of data, sometimes using phone surveys, sometimes online surveys, and sometimes face-to-face. And they try to understand, what is happening in the Ukrainian society. And there was an excellent article published today by our friend and colleague from this Gradus research company, Evgenia Bliznuk. She wrote an article about Ukrainian nation, and she called Ukraine the nation of tired optimists. So she and I work close with her. We run surveys, and we can put together many waves of surveys during the war and before the invasion. So we have surveys conducted in March, April, May, July. So there is some trends that we can draw from. So first trend that we observe in the data is that quite a lot of Ukrainians are still optimistic. 80% of respondents believe in the victory of Ukraine. They believed in March, they believed in April, and they believe it today. Also, we observe an increased trust in national institutions. So from 60 to 62% constantly during these waves, 60% of people trust to the military, 45-50%, depending on the wave, trust to the president of Ukraine, and 35-40% of Ukrainians trust to volunteers. Again, consistently over this period of time. So there was no backlash, no disappointing in military, presidential power, or fellow volunteers. In fact, there is even a deeper comparison. We can compare this data with the October of 2021. So we have some long trends to draw comparisons with. And there are data about trust, general social trust, whether people think that it's they can trust to anyone anonymously, trust to neighbors, or trust to friends and kin. All these items showed increase. So to give you an example, in October 2021, only 35% of Ukrainians trust to people in their own town, in their village, in the place they live. And now it's 62%. So it's almost twice. So increase is amazing. And then the same we observe in other items, trust to neighborhood, your not just people in your town, but people in the neighborhood or your friends. What else? Quite interestingly, we have some other data from the Academy of Science, Institute of Sociology at the Academy of Science. They conducted surveys just before the invasion in February, and they conducted a survey now, and they asked people about their identity, whether Ukrainians primarily, whether respondents primarily identify as Ukrainians, or maybe they identify, as just a dweller of your town or village, or a person can identify as, let's say, a person of the global world or post-Soviet person. So, there are some options that people can pick. So before the invasion, about 60% of respondents said that they primarily identify as Ukrainians. So they have the attachment to the Ukrainian statehood and nation. And now, in a very recent survey, it was 80%. So they increased from 60 to 80. It's a very significant increase, and it shows that Ukrainians, especially now in times of this invasion, they still, they strongly adhere to the national identity. And then there is a bit controversial issue. So there is a conflicting data because different surveys, they show slightly different outcomes. And I guess it can be explained by different methodology and different timing of the questions. And it is a very interesting and puzzling research question for, for scholars to debate about and to address this puzzle. It is a question about democracy. To what extent Ukrainians appreciate democracy now, especially in time of war? Because you can think, you can pose different hypotheses. On the one hand, during war, you want a bit, a centralized power to be strong, to be decisive. So you would expect some strong leadership. And that's what we see in some surveys, in survey which was published just now by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. Their survey showed that a lot of Ukrainians appreciate stronger hand right now, stronger leadership. At the same time, there is another survey conducted by a group of international scholars, by Henry Hale from George Washington University, by Olga from Manchester. They collected the so-called panel data. And panel data is something very interesting, is when you have a group of people and you follow these people again and again over a long period of time. So you ask the same people whether they change their mind about some, specific policies or any other attitude. So in this second case, the data of Onuch and Hale, this panel data showed actually increase, that a lot of Ukrainians appreciate democracy and democratic rule, even during the war. So there is still a debate, we don't know exactly what is happening here. There could be some tendencies, but I think it's quite logical that, during the war, people appreciate some stronger leadership. And at the same time, there is a parallel evidence that Ukrainians still value democracy and democratic regime, even in these, difficult times. So drawing from all that, I'm quite optimistic. I think that Ukrainians show a strong resilience, strong adherence to their state, to the nation, and a willingness to support democratic institutions. One part of the question by analysts was about different social groups. And quite interestingly, we do not observe a lot of variation by different groups. So Ukrainians are quite united, men and women, young and senior people, those who live in Western or Eastern regions. They're quite homogeneous in their attitudes. You know, if you have 80% of respondents who adhere to their national identities, it means that there is almost no variation by, you know, different socio-demographic groups. And I also think it's quite telling about what is happening in Ukraine. So Ukraine now is quite a solidified united nation. Yeah, I think that's you know, the basis, and I would love to speak more during Q&As.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. So, President Mylovanov, let me turn to you then on that. Listening to Rector Brik talk about changes in people's attitudes, I'm just wondering, before we turn to more formal questions, whether you could say anything about your own, how your own views have changed. When we met 6 months ago, you were already an internationally renowned figure, a very seasoned leader, someone who had a lot of experience in government. You've been through a lot in the last 6 months. How do you think this experience has changed you and your views about politics or other things?
I would think not much, actually.
Interesting.
Yes, the war has become routine. One gets used to it. I have become more proud of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people than before, and I'm much more optimistic about the future of Ukraine, because this tragedy shows that Ukraine is brave enough to stand up to a major military. It also, Ukraine has broken the myth that the Russian military is capable of conducting fast and coordinated modern operations, despite how much effort they put. So, you know, I watched a Bullet Train yesterday, where I am, and there is this with Brad Pitt, right? A movie some of you might or might not have seen, but there is basically, you know, the plot is it's an action comedy, but there is this evil figure, you know, the kind of the former Russian, you know, who is a head of Yakuza or something like that, and it's called White Death. And you know, there's this perception that this guy came from Russia and he's extremely nasty and he killed everyone and something. And this is based on this cultural international acceptance of Russia being super tough, and you know, so in terms of physical coercion, military, that myth is there no more. So I think if this movie were made 2 years from now, a year from now, I hope it wouldn't be Ukrainian, this evil person, but it's definitely won't be a Russian with this omnipresent and omnipowerful force. So I think that's what changed. My perception of Ukraine actually changed, and I'm very, very proud that I serve in Ukraine in a very broad sense and build a university and has been a part of the government during this transformational historic times. I think the new Cold War is coming. Ukraine will be the center of gravity on the part of the democracies. Ukraine has a long way to go to clean up its act in terms of institutions, corruption, contracts, rule of law. But it has gone a long way over the last 8 years, from 3,000 of protesters on Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity, fighting its own government and secret police, being shot and protecting themselves with wooden helmets and wooden shields, to a fully fledged army standing up to Russia and basically stalling it today. So it happened in just over 8 years. So imagine what can happen to institutions and democracy and the economy in the next 8 years. This is just fascinating. So I think Ukraine is the future in so many ways, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. I think that's how we changed. So I grew up a little bit. I think that's what happened.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges now facing the Zelensky administration?
Yeah, you know, the economy has not collapsed. The government is functioning. And the budget financing, I think, is the major issue. Up to 25% of the budget of the fiscal gap is currently being printed, essentially through monetary means through the central bank. And that's not sustainable in the longer run. So more support is needed. The war is expensive. The total budget expense per month for the army and the weapons, not the support that we get, just additional, is another $5-6 billion per month. And this is very little compared to what Russia is spending. It's probably 1/3 or 1/5 of what they're spending. But nonetheless, it's up to 75% of all our budget expenditures. So imagine 75% of our budget expenditures, which were not there before, a year before. So our public finance gap is huge, and we need some kind of more coordinated support internationally, because there are promises, but then there's no delivery on macro financial support or assistance. And in the military area, after the Ramstein, the first meeting, there's this now a platform where the ministers or the governments, coordinate their support and coordinate what Ukraine needs and what Ukraine does, what Ukraine produces domestically, and what Ukraine imports and gets granted. Something like that is needed for the macroeconomic support, I think, and it's needed now because we probably have risks that it will accelerate.
And on that specifically, could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of international investment on the private side, not the sort of aid side, but the corporate side, and what are some of the challenges surrounding procuring that investment and keeping those multinational partners in Ukraine?
So companies, if I can say, quote unquote, patriotic in sense of supporting Ukraine. And there are discussions about having them pledge investments in the future, but a lot of projects are stalled, for technical reasons or for commercial reasons. The technical reason that is just legally impossible to invest. Most of the companies have clauses which prohibit to invest or continue to operate in an active war zone or wartime economy. Then you also, from the commercial perspective, you have a technical problem of calculating the risk, the military risk, the war risk. So you can calculate the commercial risk, assume at least there are procedures. But if you go to a credit committee or investment committee, you need to put a number on the war risk. And it's extremely difficult. No one has expertise for that. And so that's why the decisions are not made. There are exceptions. There are facilitations of private investments through EBRD, through some of the other IFIs, some of the banks which are international and present in Ukraine. They continue to offer investment opportunities, loans, credit lines, and they then insure them through their paternal companies in other countries. So that is still ongoing, but I think FDIs or any other investments during the war are going to be 1/10 of what it was before. And just to compare, Ukraine has 43 million people, 45 or 30 if you want, and Taiwan has 23. And in Taiwan, the FDIs last year were $200 billion, and in Ukraine, they are of the order of 100 of that, $2 to $3 billion. So, we have a long way, and now we're going to be talking in hundreds of millions, this year. So after the war, we really have to step it up and buy orders. Finally, you can do a war insurance. You can provide a war insurance for reconstruction and other projects during the war, and that could also be a coordinated effort, and that needs to be, and I've been talking about this and pushing for this and advocating for this. We really need war insurance. The war is going for private businesses, because we need active private business so that after the war, the private sector is striving.
Interesting. You're suggesting that international insurance companies offer this insurance to multinationals. Is that correct? Is that
correct? So the specific issue, you build a warehouse or a kind of some logistical center somewhere in Western Ukraine. The chances that you're going to get hit by missile are really small, but they're non-zero. You have to be insured against that in order to get decent capital financing conditions, and someone has to do it. And for an insurance company, the chances that there will be a claim are equal to 1 among all, yeah, because the missile will land somewhere. There is opportunities for insurance, and the international companies and IFIs and maybe the governments have to come together and provide that.
Very interesting. Thank you. So Michael, let's turn to the military side of this. So for months, Ukraine has been signaling its intent to launch a offensive in the south. What's your assessment of that plan? And do you think the Ukrainian military has the capability to achieve its objectives?
So let me step back first and take a look at broadly where we are militarily. So we're in what I now call the period of attrition. Neither side has shown the ability to deliver a knockout blow, if you will, against the other. And so we're seeing this relative, I'm not trying to minimize what is going on the ground, but if you look at the changes in territorial occupation, it's been relatively static for about 6 weeks now. And you look, depending on what source you want to use, the Russians have lost, killed, wounded, missing, probably something on the order of 60,000 military individuals. Ukraine, depending on what source you want to use, probably on the order of 10,000. So the Russians clearly orders of magnitude in terms of military loss. At the same time, both nations remain strong internally politically. Neither leader is under significant internal domestic pressure to end this conflict right now. Neither Putin nor Zelensky. And that's not a criticism in any way, it's just a reflection of where we find ourselves. And so I think if you look at it from a Russian perspective, given the loss rate that they've sustained, they are trying to figure out, I think, do we need to pivot to a different strategy? Do we need to think about in some way coming up with something that declares victory? Or can we come up with something that potentially paints Ukraine in a different light? It's one reason why, for example, you see the Russians really fixated on that nuclear plant issue at the moment, to the point where just yesterday they went to the UN Security Council demanding a hearing, arguing, well, look at how Ukraine is putting this largest nuclear facility in Europe in danger. Ukraine and the West arguing that's not true. It's the Russian occupation of this that is creating the danger here. So you can see the Russians are trying to figure out, are there ways that they can come up with pressure that places this conflict in a potentially different light? I think they're going to fail miserably, but you can tell them thinking about it. Most military observers had predicted, well, the Russians would keep pushing in the Donbass. It appears at the moment that they thought they need to consolidate a little bit. I think that's a reflection of just the massive casualty rates that Ukraine has imposed upon them. From a Ukraine perspective, because the lines have been relatively static over the course of the last 6 weeks, much talk about, can a Ukraine demonstrate military capacity to drive the Russians out of at least some segments of the territory the Russians have occupied? You can see most people focused on the south, directly across the land bridge from Crimea. Some thoughts, I think, that Ukraine probably waiting till they create a little bit more damage. You've seen them doing long-range artillery strikes against the flow of logistics and supports that the Russians bring into that area. I think they're trying to isolate it using the long-range missile and artillery capabilities that the US and the West have given them. You've seen Ukraine start to use special forces and some measure of insurgent capability in Crimea to go after Russian military infrastructure well behind the lines. Again, I think trying to send an important message to the Russians, both about Ukraine's resolve, but quite frankly, also trying to weaken Russia's ability to militarily sustain their presence and their effort in Ukraine. I suspect you will see a Ukraine offensive set of activities in the south. I suspect it's probably some number of weeks away. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 48 hours, but on the other hand, I don't think it's a month away. Because I think Ukraine feels, hey, we've got to show that not only have we blunted the Russians from further advance, but we can push them back. We can incrementally regain some of the territory. So it'll be interesting to see. Another thing that's very interesting to me, the number of refugees that have returned to Ukraine. You're in the millions now that have come back home, which is a great development. Now that also puts challenges on Ukraine's government, just given the damage that they've experienced. They have a huge displaced internal population. So to the points made previously, we tended to focus on the military dimension of support from the West, but increasingly to me, the economic piece is going to start to become more and more important, particularly to sustain this over time.
That's very interesting. I have to ask you, the NPT negotiations are coming to an end in New York. How do you assess the risk that a nuclear weapon could be used in this conflict?
So from Putin's perspective, he knows that the West, particularly the United States, is really concerned and obsessed in some ways with the potential of the Russian use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. I think he realizes that that's a distinct concern / fear on the part of the US. There is no doubt if the Russians did not have nuclear weapons, the US would be taking a totally different approach to this situation. I believe you would see US forces on the ground directly partnering with Ukraine. You'd see a no-fly zone with US military aircraft partnering with Ukraine and the NATO alliance. But because of the nuclear dimension here, there's always been concern on the US about, hey, we just don't want to push that too far. I still think that Putin's, while he contemplates it, I don't think it's his first choice. On the other hand, he increasingly finds himself in this morass where he can neither go any further seemingly or extract himself without making it look as somehow as if he was defeated. And so, as I said before, I think he's trying to figure out, how do we change this status quo? And I suspect there are some people around him arguing, well, a nuclear weapon potentially would be a game changer, would really push the West back on their heels. Now, I don't agree with that. My attitude would be, if you ever went down that road, you would totally change the dynamic in this conflict. And now you would see it broaden out much further. So bottom line, I don't think his inclination is to do it right now, but we shouldn't minimize the fact that I suspect they continue to contemplate it or think about it. And that is worrisome in and of itself.
Well, Gayle, let's turn from nuclear weapons to the weaponization of nuclear power. So what could you give us your assessment of the unfolding situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? I know you have a lot of inside knowledge of what's going on there.
Yeah, I think we can all assess that the problem is very dire. I mean, International Atomic Energy Association, which answers to the UN, they've actually asked for a close analysis for months now. They said that the problems that were set up were very difficult. There are snipers that are standing on top of buildings trying to force people to go to work. There are people are being held at gunpoint, the Ukrainian workers. So while the Russians have control of the plant, the Ukrainians are still expected to do their job. And there have even been some people that have been taken out and killed. So these very rough Russian troops, if you can even call them troops, they're almost terrorists in some way. They've made safe work almost impossible. And I will say that working in a nuclear power plant is extremely stressful. I mean, it's worse than air traffic control for stress. So here are these workers with much less work, with much more work per person working under such duress. And I think one indicator of how badly they think the situation is that many of the workers have actually sent their families out of the area for fear that there's going to be a nuclear disaster. We saw this actually happen when Chernobyl blew. A lot of people in Chernobyl knew what was going on, and they sent their families to distant places like Armenia and other places to be safe. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. There are a large number of drills that are going on, almost constantly. And then there is the threat, and I think this is a real threat actually, that Russia is going to reroute the electricity of the plant. They've already talked about it. They've done some efforts to reroute it. They want to reroute it to go through Crimea. And rerouting electricity in a power plant is not a trivial task. The safety protocols of the plant usually require constant power. If it comes off power for a period of time, it can be very dangerous. In addition, there are, and I think this is especially true for Zaporizhzhia, that there are many spent fuel rods there that without power will become hot and could become a REEES. So I think there are many potential dangers there that are really significant. I know yesterday there was a meeting at the UN Security Council to talk about it. I don't know the details of how that meeting went, but I did hear that there was a lot of rhetoric that went from Russia out, and not a lot of discussion that went on formally, though possibly there is some good discussion going on behind closed doors. And that's been my experience at the UN with Russia through all of this.
So could you just say a couple words about what the threat actually is? So what kind of accident would we face if the power went off, and what would be the impact of that?
Look, it's almost impossible to predict because it depends on exactly what happens. So there could be an accidental leak of radiation, which can contaminate very small areas, but it could also spread to very large areas. And that would be a low level radiation, but enough to maybe cause risk of cancer. On the other hand, if there were a more significant accident, which could also happen, particularly with playing with the power, then you could actually lead to a meltdown, or you could lead to spent fuel rods becoming hot and exposed. They have to be cooled in order to stay inactive, and that could cause massive damage. A missile that hit could be a major incident for Europe. Certainly, power plants were never meant to operate under these conditions. One thing perhaps to realize is that Zaporizhzhia is a little bit better constructed than Chernobyl was, so it seems to be able to withstand a little bit more. But I don't think it was ever intended for shelling or anything else. I mean, we know a few months ago that a high caliber bullet went through the outer wall of reactor 4. That there was an artillery shell that got struck the electric transformer at reactor 6, and these almost led to major accidents, but the crew was able to keep it safe. But how often can you withstand this? I don't think we know.
Wow, thank you so much. Ian, let's turn to you now. So as the war drags on, you're a diplomat and an expert in diplomacy. How do you see this war shaping the future of diplomacy more generally?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that, Annalise. And also, I want to wish our Ukrainian colleagues happy National Day. Heroyam Slava. It's been, obviously there is a very different kind of diplomacy going on. And I think it's different mostly because of the absence of one thing that you'd expect with a war of this scale, and that would be some kind of negotiating process. There is no negotiating process. That doesn't mean there's no diplomacy. There's quite a bit of diplomacy going on. And it won't be surprising for you to hear that the diplomacy on the part of the US and Russia are definitely kind of opposing diplomacies. On the US side, it's to maintain unity among the Euro-Atlantic community, NATO and the EU, and among the G7 to support Ukraine, especially militarily, and also to impose costs on Russia to make that diplomatic solution more possible. And of course, on the Russian side, their priority is to try and break that unity among the Euro-Atlantic community, and also limit or discourage military support for Ukraine. And on the side of trying to break the unity, winter is coming, and the main gas company of Russia just turned off the gas going to Western Europe. I mean, even before then, they had only been supplying about 20% of what they normally supply. They're supposedly only turning it off for 10 days, but we'll see what happens after 10 days. And of course, the goal here is to try and break that unity, to have some countries that are seeing their citizens having to lower their thermostats, having to ration gas to factories, which would lead to job losses, having that kind of pressure lead to separate deals with Russia. and thereby breaking this really, I think, very impressive unity that NATO, the EU, and Washington has been able to maintain. And then on the side of discouraging the West from providing high-tech, sophisticated weapons, particularly long-range weapons, there has been some, I think, effectiveness in the Russian stance of threatening an escalation and even waving the nuclear saber. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was asked about this. Why aren't we providing longer range weapons? And he said very simply, we're concerned about triggering World War II. There is pressure within the Beltway for the White House to provide some of these longer range weapons to try and change the equation on the battlefield. And in this regard, Annalise, I'd keep an eye on a couple of referenda that are coming up in September. Some of the occupied regions have scheduled referenda calling for their regions, sovereign Ukrainian territory, of course, now occupied, to become part of the Russian Federation, for them to be annexed. And of course, if occupied territory that is now that US and Western weapons are, Ukraine is using them to try and push out the Russians from that territory. If that territory suddenly becomes sovereign Russian territory, of course, that's going to, I think that's going to change a lot of people's calculations. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it is something worth keeping an eye on.
Very interesting. All right, well, from public opinion in Ukraine, let's turn now to public opinion in Russia. So Olga, yesterday we had the televised memorial for Daria Dugina, the right-wing commentator killed by a car bomb outside of Moscow. I'm sure you've been following this closely. What has caught your attention about the way that particular event is unfolding? And more generally, do you see any major shifts in Russian public opinion about the war since we first started talking about this 6 months ago?
Yeah, thank you, Annalise, for organizing this great event again. Happy Independence Day to our Ukrainian colleagues. З Днем Незалежності. I wish you to successfully protect your independence and to see the victory as soon as possible. Turning back to your questions. Ms. Dugina, Daria Dugina, she was a young conservative journalist, 29 years old, not really known to anyone, with exception to one important detail about her. She was a daughter of a very famous hardcore conservative thinker, philosopher, if you want, or conspiracy theorist in Russia, Mr. Dugin, who was considered more or less close to Mr. Putin. And largely an ideologist of nationalist movement and nationalist sentiment in Russia, and also anti-Ukrainian, the war against Ukraine. So her being killed, being murdered in Russia, not far from Moscow, has of course raised lots of questions. The coverage of the events there in Russia and, for example, here in the United States is very different. In Russia, nobody thinks that this wasn't done by the hands of Ukrainians. Everybody points fingers at Ukrainians because of the father of this person, and again, she herself wasn't known to anyone. And they think that this was a mistake somehow. There's lots of conspiracy theories around who and why, did it. However, this is a very big event that got lots of coverage domestically right now, and very harsh language and rhetoric, again, from the chief propagandist in the country. In general, when we talk about the sentiment and also maybe effect of sanctions which were imposed on the country, we have to note that the size of the sanctions was historic, right? So the amount of sanctions imposed on Russia has never been imposed on any other country before. Following the attack of Russia towards Ukraine, Western countries targeted wealthy individuals, banks, businesses, and state-owned enterprises, and also not only states imposed these sanctions, but international companies suspended their trading in Russia and or withdrew altogether, such as McDonald's, Coca-Cola, IKEA, and so on. Whether sanctions are hurting Russia and whether they are influencing opinion of Russians is a question. On the one hand, supermarket shelves in Moscow and other large cities are pretty full. Restaurants and bars remain open. People stopped traveling to EU largely, but actually they stopped doing this during the pandemic, but instead they travel around the country. So there is a boom of domestic tourism. They travel to Turkey and United Arab Emirates. It's very popular. Ruble exchange rate is stronger now than before the invasion. But IMF, International Monetary Fund, predicts Russia's economy will contract 6% this year. The previous predictions were that the contraction will be 10%. Now it's 6%, so it's kind of better than it was expected to. However, we cannot say that the sanctions are not working. Collapsing imports of components have hobbled all kinds of manufacturing, most prominently car production, which plummeted by almost 62% in the first half of the year. Retail sales fell 10% in the second quarter compared to the previous year. Consumer confidence, again, we're talking about public opinion, sees the lowest level since 2015, and almost 80% of Russians do not plan any major purchases. While sanctions might not be working as fast as maybe Western countries expected them to work, they do constrain, in the long-term effect, the ability of Russia to wage war. The long-term impact on the country will be immense, damaging it. They do not stop the war, but they will continue to hurt it. As to the audiences and the people in the country, from 150 to 200,000 Russians left the country since end of February and are now in exile. Those are intellectuals, scientists, IT specialists. This is actually the largest post-Soviet wave of immigration from Russia. President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson called for Russian scientists and IT specialists to leave Russia, and they're organizing support for them here in the West, trying to encourage brain drain from Russia and further to contribute to problems with its development in the future. The position that fought Putin's regime for the past 2 decades, over 20 years actually, is mostly crashed though. Some are in exile, like these hundreds of thousands of Russians, or like Khodorkovsky. Others are in jail, like Mr. Navalny. Some are killed, like Mr. Nemtsov. Sanctions haven't turned the remaining Russians, though, against Putin or the war. Quite the opposite. If you remember, maybe you don't, during our first discussion, we did not see the so-called Crimean consensus. There was no overwhelming support for the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine. Only around like a small majority, 56 to 60% of Russians supported it, and there was really a large shock seen among the audiences. Right now, we see 75 to 82% supporting the war, and these numbers remain stable. There is, however, lack of economic optimism, as I mentioned, and as the economic situation will continue to get worse, this discontent will grow. However, whether and when this could lead to mass protests and even overthrow of the government, it's a big question from my opinion. Like I said, leaders of the opposition are in jail, in exile, or murdered. Media field is strongly controlled. Propaganda is ruling the minds of the population. Harsh anti-protest and anti-dissent laws have crushed the position, promising 10 to 20 years in jail for those who dissent. And I'm not even talking about peaceful protests. I'm talking about posts on social media and public interviews and discussions such as this one that we're having here. Over 80% of Russians support Vladimir Putin right now. However, Mr. Putin will not live forever. Yet who will follow him is a big question. I'm not too optimistic, I have to be honest, that this person will be a pro-Western democratic leader. Anti-Western sentiment grew immensely. The country seems to be more and more turning towards the East. Trade balance with countries such as China, India, Turkey, Middle Eastern countries grew fast. So while we see the West is turning its back to Russia, Russia is turning its back to the West too.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Ben, let me just turn to you now and I'll talk a little bit about accountability in this conflict. So there have been thousands and thousands of documented incidences of potential war crimes committed by Russia against Ukrainians. How practically can Russia be held accountable? What will this look like, not just sort of in the abstractions of international law, but in practice? And what does justice begin to look like for the victims?
Right, so that's difficult to answer. Victims in some sense have to answer that themselves. But the key point of departure is that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations with the ability to veto any resolutions, which means the ability to veto most forms of action that could be taken by the United Nations. And that's key because the International Court of Justice is one possible avenue that has already ruled effectively in favor of Ukraine. Interestingly, in a twist on the question of whether or not it's genocide, it's actually Russia who initially invaded on the pretext of an alleged genocide taking place in Ukraine, and Ukraine successfully brought this to the International Court of Justice, that this was a false pretense and therefore the invasion is illegal. The International Court of Justice in March ruled in favor of that. However, although its ruling says that the hostilities should cease, Russia has clearly not abided by it, because at that point it gets thrown to the United Nations and the Security Council, at which point not just Russia, but also China is a major in the way. The ICC also is a non-starter because Russia is not only not ratified it, but actually withdrawn its signature after the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And some sort of Nuremberg type tribunal is also highly unlikely without a victory and unconditional surrender. So that leaves much more along the lines of either what Ukraine itself can do, and Ukraine already has in captured soldiers and combatants and paramilitaries and trying them, or what can be done in civil courts in terms of lawsuits. And here the blocked assets is what has gotten the attention of Ukrainians, but also people in the outside world, whether the 400 billion or more blocked assets of the Russian state or Russian individuals can be repurposed. And that's complicated. The Economist had an exploration of this recently, and that's complicated because of individual laws within each country having to do with private property. But perhaps there is a way there, and I'll end with this, there is a way there that illustrates what happened in the Lockerbie case, for example, following Libya's involvement in the explosion of the passenger plane, which basically individual civil suits and verdicts can then be leveraged by sovereign states after the end of a conflict in order to get a belligerent, a country that's committed genocide, war crimes, or terrorism to pay out. And that essentially would look like the Western states would refuse to release the blocked assets if Russia did not agree to use part of them to pay compensation. And that's one potential avenue.
Very interesting. So, Jordan, I want to end with you here and shift to the future a little bit. And we actually have a question from the audience, which we can fit in here, saying, when and how will this conflict, will this war end? So I'd love your thoughts on that. But shifting to the future, what do you see as the long-term geopolitical implications of this prolonged war? And what will be the implications for Russia, for Ukraine, indeed for the United States' place in the world? What do you think?
I think the long-term implications are that we entered a fundamentally new era on February 24th, 2022. And it was an era that we were already shifting to away from. I mean, if you think about a post-Cold War era where everybody was fairly, in the West, was euphoric about there being minimal conflicts other than limited civil wars, and the focus was globalization and trade and economics, and then going into a world of terrorism after 9/11. And we were already drifting before Russia's February 2022 invasion towards a world where, again, geopolitics and clashes between major powers was the primary issue of concern. But with Russia's invasion, we went fully over that cliff, and that's the world we're in, and that's the world we're going to be in for a long time. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to call it a Cold War. It maybe is, maybe it's not. That's a complicated question, but we definitely are in a world of geopolitical conflict, again, between major powers. And that's going to be for sure something that's going to be affecting us all. It's not just going to be a question of overall that new era, but also in terms of asking about how this affects the United States. We have been trying for several administrations to switch our emphasis and our priority to Asia and to China, and that's going, if that's going to happen, that's going to have to happen now while not ignoring Russia for the foreseeable future and with having a significant European imprint. So that's going to be one of the lasting impacts of this. But what I would really emphasize is that I can't foresee how this conflict will end, but it is the way it ends is going to have a huge impact, not just for Ukraine. It's going to affect the way this new era plays out fundamentally. And I say this because it's easy, I think, I mean, a lot has happened in these 6 months in the Western world that is distracting, and those are legitimate distractions. And then people have hardships that are not on par with what someone in Ukraine is experiencing. But for somebody who's never been to that region, who feels like it's far away, who lives in the United States, who's not even part of Europe, who's maybe never been to Europe, I'm sympathetic to understanding that this feels like a distant conflict, but it's fundamentally not, and it's fundamentally not over. And I think those are things that people who are only following this tangentially need to be aware of. Things perhaps have turned out much better than many people, at least in the West, expected when back in February or early March for the side of Ukraine. But as others here have been talking about, there's no guarantee that Ukraine has the firepower to mount a full offensive and push Russia back out of the Donbass. And what that depends on is straightforward. It depends on support from the West. And there's no guarantee that this war can be supported over the long term in terms of the finances that need from the West. And that depends straightforwardly on politics in Europe and America. And it depends on public support and people understanding what's at stake. So what's at stake is whether this comes out as a war where major powers that want to break down international norms get slapped in the face and decide it's not worth it, or a war where they get rewarded for that. And that's straightforward in terms of whether Ukraine wins or not. It's also going to depend on whether it's still seen as a fundamentally democratic world and democratic era when this is all over. And that again depends on whether the democracy who's standing up to Russia, Ukraine, wins or doesn't win. So these are things that are going to affect absolutely everybody. And I hope that people in the United States can see this, can cut through the noise, can cut through the types of op-eds and other types of discussion that you regularly see about the importance of negotiations and things like this. Those are absolutely at a time that it's right to do it. Those will be important. But right now, the only way that this can end in a way that doesn't involve Russians occupying part of Ukraine, which means, to be clear, not just that Ukraine gets territory, but that Ukrainians get tortured and raped, and that genocide, like Ben was talking about, continues. And so that there is not a halfway here. It's either a question of Ukraine defends itself and removes Russia from places that is occupying, or significant suffering continues. And so I hope that the American public, the European public can recognize this and see that this is a straightforward issue about shaping the future of the world and geopolitics, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us.
Well said. Tymofii Mylovanov, I want to end with you and maybe just put that question from our audience to you just as a place to start. You know, what are the scenarios that people you respect in Kyiv are batting around about when and how this war might come to an end and how the geopolitics of the region will be changed?
One thing is that it's really been shaped on the ground. It's from the Western perspective, this war, this conflict tends to be perceived as the conflict between the West and Russia. Mm-hmm. That's also the perception in the Kremlin. that Ukraine is, okay, is a part of the game, but it's really, if only the West stopped supporting Ukraine. And the situation today is different, that the West is supporting Ukraine. But we can go down back to 2014, and we can recall how during the Revolution of Dignity, 3 foreign ministers of the European Union countries came to Ukraine and negotiated an agreement between the protesters and the pro-Russians, now clearly supported by the Russia at the time, President Yanukovych. And they were happily, after negotiating the agreement, both the leaders of the protest and the Yanukovych team agreed on the conditions. They happily got on a plane and flew back to Brussels and elsewhere. And nothing what they negotiated realized. Nothing. Zero. They have no influence on the outcome of 2014 revolution in Ukraine. But they kept negotiating, they kept providing incentives for the government and the protesters to do something. So I think something similar is happening in Ukraine. And I think both the Kremlin and the West would be better served if they accepted that there are some fundamental issues happening in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, and Kazakhstan, by the way, too, and Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Moldova and the Baltic states too. They related to the dynamics which started after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But these negotiations or support or not, they can determine how many people will die and how fast the resolution of this conflict will come about. But they will not determine. This is essentially the existential conflict about whether it's true, I agree, the future of the world will be dictated, at least in that region in Europe, by power or by diplomacy, by force or by the rule of law. But at the same time, it also determines whether that region will be democratic or not. And it affects all other countries around. So in that sense, I think it's going to go until the very end. We can decide and try to affect in which form it will happen, whether it will be more of a frozen conflict. Are we going to postpone it and negotiate some peace agreements to have another episode 2 or 3 years from now, maybe in a different country even. But fundamentally, it is about, it will be resolved by Russia either becoming a democratic country or apologies, either Russia becoming a democratic country or Russia consuming the neighboring countries. So I think these are the scenarios. The intermediate scenario is some kind of Cold War scenario, the new Cold War, where Ukraine will be on the front of it, the Baltic countries will be on the front of it, Belarus will be with Russia, and other countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, that will have to be determined and played out. So I think those are the 3 scenarios that we are facing in the longer run. In the shorter run, the Russian military is exhausted at this point, and if Ukraine is able to mobilize more support, including the military support, it will be able to push forward. It has been able to push forward in 2014, 2015, 2016 in Donbass, but especially in 2015 and 2016, Russia, when it got pushed back, really sent some real strong military and created Debaltseve and Ilovaisk. But I also think that if we remember the Revolution of Dignity and Yanukovych, it was getting really, really dark. People were being killed, cities were, Kyiv was being burned, and then Yanukovych ran. No one could have predicted that, no one. So in that sense, I think the future is unpredictable, and something is going to give, either Ukraine or Russia At this point, if this stalemate is going to continue, at some point, something is going to give, something is going to collapse. I am pretty sure it's not going to be Ukraine. So in that sense, it would be better to give Ukraine proper support so that things comes to an end faster. That would be in everyone's interest. Thank you.
Well said. Well, on that note, I just want to express from all of us, what an honor it is to be with you, Tymofii and Tymofii, on this panel. And from all of us, we wish you a very happy Independence Day and look forward to next steps together. And I really want to thank all of our panelists for what has been an extremely insightful set of commentaries. To learn more about this, please visit our website, buffett.northwestern.edu, where we can connect you to everyone on this panel and sign you up for future events. So thank you all so much. And until next time, thank you. Bye.